There is a multi-billion-dollar industry built entirely on convincing you that wellness comes in a bottle, capsules, powders, subscription boxes shipped to your door, each one promising to deliver what your body is missing. And meanwhile, for thousands of years before any of that existed, grandmothers across 6 continents were ladling something into a bowl that did the work quietly, reliably, and for the price of a handful of dried beans. Today, we are going back to that pot. We are counting down 12 forgotten plant-based soups, each one rooted in scripture, honored by ancient healers, and now being examined by modern researchers who are finding, again and again, that the old cooks were onto something real. Pay close attention to number 1. It is made from a plant. Most people yank out of their gardens without a second thought, and it turns out ancient physicians across 3 continents were cultivating it on purpose. And stay with us for number 6. There is a story connected to that bowl, a story of survival in the desert. 3 days without food, that will change the way you think about what a simple soup can do. Let us get into it. Number 12. Split pea soup, the ancient pot that outlasted empires. In the book of Genesis, Chapter 25. A man named Esau comes in from the field. So depleted, the text says he felt he was about to die, that he trades his entire inheritance for a single bowl of red pottage. Scholars have long debated the exact contents of that bowl, but the description points unmistakably to a thick legume stew, almost certainly made from dried split peas or lentils. The oldest hunger in recorded scripture was answered not with meat, not with bread, but with a pot of cooked legumes. That is not a coincidence. It is evidence of how central these humble seeds were to ancient survival. The Greeks and Romans documented split pea pottage as a staple for laborers and soldiers. In ancient Egypt, dried peas were found preserved in tomb offerings, food considered worthy enough to accompany the dead into the next world. What all these civilizations had independently discovered was that a handful of dried split peas, simmered in water, with nothing more than an onion and a bay leaf, could sustain a working person through a hard day in a way that few other foods could. Modern nutritional science is now tracing exactly why split peas are one of the richest plant sources of soluble fiber, particularly a compound called pectin, which slows the absorption of glucose into the bloodstream. A single cup of cooked split peas delivers approximately 16 grams of protein, comparable to several ounces of meat, along with substantial folate, potassium, and iron. Researchers studying legume consumption in populations with low rates of cardiovascular disease consistently find split peas among the dietary anchors. The fiber also acts as a prebiotic, feeding the beneficial bacteria in the gut in ways that researchers are only beginning to map with precision. Here is the preparation note most people miss. You do not need to soak split peas. Rinse them well. Drop them into a pot with cold water, at a ratio of roughly 1 part peas to 3 parts water. Add a chopped onion, a carrot, a rib of celery, a bay leaf, and simmer on low heat for 45 minutes to an hour until they dissolve into a thick, creamy base. Salt at the end. Not the beginning. Early salting can toughen the exterior. The finished soup should be the color of sage, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon, with a mild, earthy sweetness that needs very little else. Esau was famished, and this bowl answered him. Generations of farm families staked their winters on it. The researchers are now explaining, in molecular terms, what those ancient eaters already understood in their bones. Number 11. Old-fashioned onion soup. The pantry cure poor families trusted. In Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness list among their bitterest losses. The foods of Egypt they left behind. Onions are named, specifically held up alongside leeks and garlic, as things worth grieving. That detail tells us something important in ancient Egypt. The onion was not a flavoring. It was a food. It was sustenance. It was considered worth mourning. Ancient Egyptian laborers were recorded as consuming onions daily, and Herodotus noted that large sums were spent on onions, garlic, and radishes for the workers who built the pyramids. In medieval Europe, onion broth was prescribed for everything from fever to exhaustion. Traditional Ayurvedic medicine classified the onion as a warming, purifying food that opened the body's channels, what they called nadis, and assisted in clearing illness. The compound at the center of modern research is quercetin, a flavonoid that concentrates particularly in the outer layers of the onion, the ones most people peel away and discard. Quercetin has been studied for its effects on inflammatory pathways, and while researchers are careful to note that human trials are still developing, the preliminary findings have sustained serious scientific interest for decades. Onions also contain organosulfur compounds, the same family of chemicals that give garlic its studied properties. One specific compound, dipropyl disulfide, has been examined for its effects on platelet aggregation, essentially how blood clots form. The old European tradition of reaching for onion broth at the first sign of a cold may have been responding to effects that modern pharmacology is only recently able to describe. The preparation is almost insultingly simple, and the one thing most modern cooks rush is the one thing that cannot be rushed. Slice 3 large onions thin and cook them in a wide, heavy pot over the lowest heat you can manage. Stir occasionally. You are waiting for them to turn deep gold and completely soft. This takes 30 to 45 minutes. Not 5. The sugars caramelize slowly. The sharpness entirely disappears. And what remains is something sweet, complex, and savory. Cover with good broth. Simmer 20 minutes more. Finish with a splash of apple cider vinegar. The color will be amber. The taste will be surprisingly rich for something made from almost nothing. They did not need a laboratory to figure this out. They had centuries of watching who recovered and who did not. Number 10. Garlic soup. The old cold season pot from the farmhouse kitchen. Garlic appears in the Talmud as a food specifically recommended for Friday evening, the Sabbath meal, prescribed not merely for flavor, but because ancient rabbinical writing attributed to it properties of vitality and strengthening of the body. In Proverbs, the diligent woman's household is described as well provisioned, and garlic was among the provisions considered essential. The ancient Israelites, like the Egyptians before them, treated garlic as something between a food and a medicine. The line between those two categories was not one. Their culture drew very firmly. Egyptian papyri from 1550 BCE list 22 medicinal uses. For garlic, Roman soldiers were issued garlic as part of their campaign rations, not just for flavor, but because field commanders believed it sustained fighting capacity. In traditional Chinese medicine, garlic has been classified for over 3,000 years as an herb that tonifies qi, the life energy, and clears what practitioners called toxic heat, independently, across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The same root reached the same conclusion. The active compound allicin is produced when raw garlic is crushed or chopped and is widely studied for its antimicrobial properties. But here is the piece most people miss. Allicin is unstable and begins degrading within minutes of exposure to heat. For those interested in its studied effects, raw crushed garlic allowed to rest for 10 minutes before adding to a finished dish preserves more of the compound than garlic that goes straight into a hot pan. That said, cooked garlic has its own distinct pharmacological profile, different sulfur compounds that are more heat stable, and that researchers are studying for cardiovascular effects. The two preparations are genuinely different medicines, which is why ancient traditions often specified whether garlic should be eaten raw or cooked. For the soup, take 2 whole heads of garlic, separate and peel the cloves, and sauté them gently in olive oil over medium-low heat until pale gold, not brown, not dark. A burned clove makes the entire pot bitter and sharp. Add 1 diced onion, 1 large potato cut into rough pieces. Pour in enough vegetable broth to cover generously, and simmer 30 minutes. Then mash or blend smooth. The result will be ivory-colored, mellow, almost sweet. Nothing like raw garlic. You may float a poached egg in it, or lay a piece of toasted sourdough across the top. As French farmhouse tradition prescribe, drink it warm at the first sign of a cold. That advice predates the Roman Empire, and the research is beginning to explain why it circulated for so long. Number 9. Cabbage soup. The winter workhorse that never let a family down. In the apocryphal book of Judith, cabbage appears among the provisions carried into the enemy camp. Practical, compact, nourishing. The ancient Hebrews referred to it in the Mishnah as a food that fortifies and sustains, but cabbage's deepest scriptural resonance may be more indirect throughout the Old Testament. The image of the preserved harvest stored up against the coming winter, carefully guarded, is used as a metaphor for wisdom itself. And nothing in the ancient kitchen preserved more reliably than a head of cabbage. Ancient Roman writers praised cabbage extravagantly, with Cato the Elder claiming in his agricultural writings that Rome owed its health to the vegetable. In traditional Korean medicine, fermented cabbage kimchi has been used for over 2,000 years as a digestive tonic and immunity food. Across Germanic and Slavic folk medicine, raw cabbage juice was applied to wounds and inflammations, while simmered cabbage was recommended for those recovering from illness. 3 entirely separate medical traditions, all circling the same plant. Modern research has focused particularly on glucosinolates, sulfur-containing compounds that give cabbage its slightly pungent smell when cooked. When broken down during digestion, glucosinolates produce compounds, including sulforaphane and indole. 3. Carbinol, which have been studied extensively in laboratory settings for their effects on cellular processes. Cabbage is also notably high in vitamin K. A single cup of cooked cabbage provides over 70% of the daily recommended amount, and vitamin C was historically the reason sailors were instructed to carry sauerkraut on long voyages as protection against scurvy. Add cabbage in stages. The outer leaves early, the tender interior leaves in the final 10 minutes. This preserves texture and prevents the sulfurous smell that comes from overcooking. 1 cup of roughly chopped cabbage, 1 dispotato, 1 large onion, a handful of white beans, 2 carrots, and enough broth to cover. Simmer 40 minutes. A spoonful of tomato paste deepens the color and flavor, finished with a little apple cider vinegar. The pot improves for 2 days in the refrigerator. The flavors knit together in a way that fresh cooking cannot replicate. The grandmother, who kept a pot going on the stove for 3 days, was not being lazy. She was being wise. Number 8. Potato and leek soup. The creamy comfort that needed no cream. Leeks appear in Numbers chapter 11, alongside garlic and onions, among the foods the Israelites longed for in the wilderness. In the ancient world, the leek was so associated with the sustaining power of Egypt that it became a symbol of what was lost, a food of endurance and daily nourishment. King Nebuchadnezzar, according to ancient records, ordered leeks grown in the royal gardens of Babylon as a provisioning crop for his court. Their presence in both the humblest camp rations and the most elevated palace gardens tells you something about how universally they were trusted. Welsh tradition, which carries one of the oldest continuous relationships with the leek in the Western world, holds the plant as a national emblem. A distinction originally tied not to patriotism, but to its role in sustaining soldiers before battle. In ancient Egyptian tomb paintings, leeks are depicted as offerings alongside onions and garlic. In traditional Persian medicine, the leek was prescribed for respiratory complaints and for building blood, what we would now call iron deficiency conditions. Modern nutritional analysis shows the chiampherol content in leeks, a flavonoid that has been studied for its effects on inflammatory markers in peer-reviewed research. Leeks are also a significant source of the prebiotic fiber inulin, which is particularly valuable for feeding the beneficial bacteria Bifidobacterium in the large intestine. Unlike most vegetables, leeks retain meaningful levels of folate even after cooking. Here is the preparation detail. Most recipes gloss over leeks, trap grit between their layers in a way that is easy to miss. After slicing, soak in a bowl of cold water for 5 minutes. Then lift them out. The grit sinks to the bottom and the clean leeks float free. Sweat them slowly in olive oil for 15 minutes. Over low heat, they should become completely translucent and deeply soft. Never browned. Add diced potatoes. Cover with broth. Simmer 25 minutes. Then mash, roughly not fully blended, leaving some texture, and finish with a grating of nutmeg and good black pepper. The starch from the potato creates the creaminess. No dairy required. The soup will be pale green, slightly silky, and remarkably rich for something made from 2 vegetables and water. Number 7. Lentil soup, the ancient bowl that kept whole villages standing. We come now to the soup at the center of Scripture's most famous transaction. It is a scene worth sitting with. Esau returns from the open country, famished. The Hebrew word used suggests more than hunger. It suggests a kind of depletion that felt mortal. He finds his brother Jacob at a cooking fire with a pot of red pottage, lentils. The text in Genesis 25 says, Esau was so spent that he told Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am exhausted." He called it by its color, not its name. He was past the point of caring what it was. He needed only to be restored. Jacob, being Jacob, named his price the birthright. Esau agreed. He ate. He drank. He rose. And he went his way. And then the text adds 4 devastating words. Thus Esau despised his birthright. That is not just poetry. That is a description of what extreme physical depletion does to a person's ability to think long-term, and what answered that depletion, what reached across that broken state and pulled a man back to his feet, was a pot of red lentils. That is not a coincidence chosen by accident. The writers of Genesis understood that lentils were restoration food. In ancient Rome, lentils were stored in strategic reserves, alongside grain, considered essential enough to be part of the imperial food security system. In Ayurvedic tradition, red lentils, called masoor dal, are classified as an easily digestible, tridoshic food that builds ojas, the vital essence that underlies strength and immunity. In ancient Egyptian medicine, lentils were prescribed for physical debility and recovery from illness. 3 distinct medical traditions, independently reaching toward the same goal. Modern analysis shows why. Lentils are among the highest plant sources of iron. A single cup of cooked lentils provides approximately 37% of the daily recommended intake. They are also rich in folate and contain substantial amounts of molybdenum, a trace mineral involved in enzyme systems that process sulfur-containing amino acids. The protein in lentils is notably high in lysine, an amino acid that is typically limited in grain-based diets, which is why the ancient combination of lentils with bread was nutritionally more complete than either food alone. Studies suggest lentils also have a particularly low glycemic index. They digest slowly, producing a sustained, stable energy release that researchers have linked to the kind of endurance Esau lacked before that bowl and recovered after it. Red lentils dissolve beautifully into a smooth base. Rinse 1 cup until the water runs clear. Then combine with 3 cups of broth or water, 1 diced onion, 2 cloves of garlic, a teaspoon of cumin, and a pinch of turmeric. Simmer uncovered for 25 minutes, stirring occasionally as the lentils collapse. The pot will turn from orange to deep gold as it cooks. Finish with a squeeze of lemon. The acidity is essential, not optional. It brightens everything and improves iron absorption in the same meal. A swirl of olive oil at the end. Serve warm. Esau rose from this bowl. His body knew what it needed. The research is now explaining, in molecular detail, why it worked. If this kind of ancient knowledge resonates with you, the convergence of Scripture, traditional medicine, and modern science, hit like and subscribe, because what comes next goes even deeper. Number 6. Bean and barley soup. The stick-to-your-ribs pot for hard-working days. In 2 Samuel chapter 17, when King David is fleeing his son Absalom through the wilderness, a group of loyal followers meets him at Mahanaim with an extraordinary list of provisions. Among them roasted grain, beans, and lentils. These are brought specifically for David and his people who were, the text says, hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Barley appears throughout the Hebrew scriptures as a grain of sustenance. The loaves multiplied by Jesus in the Gospel of John are barley loaves, not wheat. This was the bread of the common people, the grain of those who worked with their hands. In ancient Mesopotamia, barley was the primary currency and the staple grain of the entire civilization. In traditional Chinese medicine, barley has been prescribed for over 2,000 years to tonify the spleen and stomach, what practitioners understood as the body's primary digestive center. In ancient Greece, the Olympic athletes' training diet was documented as heavy in barley, not wheat. Barley. Modern nutritional research has been particularly interested in a specific soluble fiber in barley called beta-glucan, which has received FDA recognition as a compound that may reduce the risk of coronary heart disease when consumed regularly. Beta-glucan works by forming a viscous gel in the digestive tract that slows the absorption of both glucose and cholesterol. Clinical trials have found reductions in LDL cholesterol in participants consuming as little as 3 grams of barley beta-glucan daily, roughly the amount in one generous bowl of barley soup. Pearl barley has slightly less beta-glucan than hulled barley because the outer bran is polished away during processing hulled barley. Harder to find, but worth seeking out. Retains more of the active compound. Soak dried beans overnight. The next morning, drain and combine with half a cup of hulled barley, 1 diced onion, 2 carrots, 2 ribs of celery, a bay leaf, and enough broth to cover generously. Simmer on low for 90 minutes. The barley will release its starch slowly, turning the broth silky and thick without any flour or cream. Do not rush this pot. The depth of flavor comes from thyme, salt only in the final 20 minutes. The finished soup will be hearty enough that a smaller bowl is genuinely satisfying. The beta-glucan creates a feeling of fullness that researchers have measured and that your body will recognize immediately. David's followers understood, in the wilderness, that this was what a depleted person needed. The science is now confirming why. Number 5. Minestrone. The everything-in-the-pot soup born from thrift. The word minestrone comes from the Latin ministrare, to serve. To minister. To tend to. Long before it was a recipe. It was a practice, the act of gathering what remained and making it into something sustaining for the household. In the Christian monastic tradition, the soup served to the poor at the monastery gate was called minestra, a simple vegetable broth assembled from whatever the kitchen had. The act of serving it was considered a spiritual practice, not merely a culinary one. Hospitality expressed through the humble pot. Medieval Italian peasant households used every part of every vegetable stems, outer leaves, wilted tops. Nothing was discarded if it could be simmered into the communal pot. This same principle of radical use, of finding nourishment in what others would waste, runs through Leviticus's instructions to leave the corners of the field unharvested for the poor. The gleaning laws, both the ancient agrarian tradition and the minestrone tradition, are grounded in the same theological conviction that provision lives in what we might overlook. Modern research on the combination of vegetables in a minestrone context has focused on phytochemical diversity, the principle that consuming a wide variety of plant compounds in a single meal produces effects that no single vegetable can produce alone. A 2017 study published in the British Journal of Nutrition found that populations consuming higher dietary diversity of plant foods showed distinct differences in gut microbiome composition compared to those eating fewer plant varieties. With results researchers considered worth exploring further: the combination of soluble fiber from beans, carotenoids from tomatoes and carrots, glucosinolates from cabbage, and flavonoids from onions in a single bowl creates a kind of phytochemical orchestra that the old Italian farmwives were conducting without knowing the names of any of the instruments. No fixed recipe exists. That is precisely the point. What does exist is a practice sweat 1 large onion and 2 cloves of garlic in olive oil until soft. Add whatever firm vegetables you have: diced carrot, zucchini, celery, then white beans, crushed tomatoes, and enough broth to cover. If you have a Parmesan rind in the refrigerator, drop it in now. Add a handful of small pasta or rice in the final 12 minutes. Finish with torn basil and a thread of good olive oil. The soup should taste like the season it was made in. That was always the intention. Number 4. Tuscan bean and bread soup. The pot that gave stale bread a second life. In the Gospel of John, chapter 6, after the miracle of the loaves and fishes, Jesus instructs his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost." Nothing is lost. That phrase, in the context of bread, carries a weight that Tuscan peasant cooking understood profoundly. The ribollita, meaning reboiled, recooked, returned to life, is built entirely on that instruction. Stale bread is not waste. It is potential. In medieval Tuscany, the rule was simple. Nothing that could nourish was discarded. Day-old bread, yesterday's bean soup, the outer leaves of the kale, all of it went back into the pot. The dish was reheated and served again, often better the second day than the first. This was not poverty thinking. It was wisdom thinking. It was the understanding that transformation through time and heat could elevate the ordinary into something remarkable. Traditional Chinese medicine has long recognized beans, particularly cannellini and white beans, as foods that tonify the kidneys and support what practitioners call the water element of the body. In Ayurvedic texts, white beans are described as sattvic foods, foods that bring clarity, steadiness, and calm to the body and mind, as opposed to rajasic foods that agitate or tamasic foods that depress. The cannellini bean at the center of ribollita is a notable source of resistant starch, starch that passes through the small intestine undigested and reaches the large intestine where it acts as a prebiotic, feeding beneficial bacteria and producing short-chain fatty acids, including butyrate, which researchers have studied for its role in colon cell health. Studies suggest that the resistant starch content increases when cooked beans are cooled, meaning day-old ribollita, reheated the next morning, may actually deliver more prebiotic benefit than freshly made soup. The old practice of reboiling has a modern nutritional argument behind it. Cook dried cannellini beans until tender. In a separate pot, sauté oignon, carrot, and celery in generous olive oil. Add the beans with their cooking liquid, crushed tomatoes, and cavolo nero or Tuscan calle. Torn roughly. Simmer 30 minutes. Then add thick slices of stale, crusty, sourdough bread, never soft sandwich bread, which dissolves without giving body. Let it absorb the broth completely. The finished soup should be extremely thick, nearly solid. Spoonable rather than pourable. Reheat it the next day. It will be better. That is not accidental. It is the whole design. Number 3. Nettle soup. The stinging weed that fed families for free. In Proverbs 24, the writer observes the field of a lazy man and finds it overgrown with thorns and nettles, and uses the image as a warning about what neglect produces. But the irony is this: in cultures that knew how to look, nettles in a field were not a sign of failure. They were a harvest. The plant that the sluggard let overtake his field was the same plant that a wiser household would gather on purpose. Ancient Egyptian herbalists documented nettle use for joint inflammation. In traditional Norse medicine, nettles were one of the sacred plants of spring gathered at the first thaw as a blood tonic after the long winter. In Persian medical tradition, Ibn Sina, the 11th century physician known in the West as Avicenna, prescribed nettle specifically for respiratory complaints, urinary conditions, and as a strengthening food for those recovering from illness. 3 civilizations across 3 continents, independently finding the weed worth cultivating. Modern nutritional analysis of Urtica dioica stinging nettle reveals a remarkably dense profile. It is one of the highest plant sources of bioavailable iron and contains significant levels of calcium, magnesium, and vitamins A and K. Nettle also contains beta-cytosterol, a plant sterol that has been studied in clinical trials for its effects on prostate health in older men with results that have sustained research interest across multiple peer-reviewed publications. A compound called scopoletin, found in nettle leaves, has been studied for its effects on uric acid metabolism, which relates to gouda condition. The old herbalists also linked to nettle use, though they described it differently. The sting caused by formic acid and histamine in the tiny needles on the leaves disappears completely within 30 seconds of hot water contact. You must wear gloves to handle raw nettles. Pick only the young top 4 leaves of plants in spring, well away from roads or agricultural land. Blanch them in boiling water for 60 seconds. Then drain. Press dry. And proceed. Sauté 1 onion and 1 large potato in olive oil until softened. Add the blanched nettles and enough broth to cover. Simmer 15 minutes. Blend completely smooth. The color will be a deep, almost electric green. Finish with a squeeze of lemon and, if you like, a swirl of cream or a poached egg floated on top. The taste is earthy, rich, and mild, something between spinach and sorrel, with none of the aggression the plant shows raw. The plant that Scripture associated with neglect was, for those with eyes to see, one of the most nutritionally generous things the spring earth offered for free. Number 2. Pumpkin and squash soup, the harvest bowl that stored all winter long. In the book of Jonah, chapter 4, God causes a vine to grow overnight to shade the prophet from the sun, and Jonah's relief is described with a word that suggests physical restoration. Not merely comfort, the plant is debated by scholars, but many traditional commentaries, including early rabbinic sources, identify it as a species of gourd or squash. Whether or not that identification is certain, the image is resonant. A gourd provides shade, sustenance, and shelter from the harshest heat. In the ancient world, these were not separate things. The plant that sheltered you was also the plant that fed you. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, the squash, along with corn and beans, formed what indigenous farmers called the Three Sisters. These 3 crops were grown together, supported each other structurally, and were understood to form a nutritionally complete diet when combined. This was not accidental companion planting. It was a sophisticated agricultural and nutritional insight encoded in traditional practice. When Aztec civilization collapsed under conquest, the knowledge of what these 3 plants did together in the body was among the things lost, though fragments survived in indigenous traditional medicine. The deep orange flesh of winter squash and pumpkin signals a high concentration of beta-carotene, a carotenoid that the body converts to vitamin A. But the bioavailability of beta-carotene is significantly enhanced by fat. A study published in the Journal of Nutrition found that pairing cooked pumpkin with even a small amount of fat increased carotenoid absorption by up to 600% compared to eating it without fat. The old habit of finishing pumpkin soup with a drizzle of olive oil or a swirl of cream was not indulgence. It was nutrition practiced intuitively for generations before anyone understood the mechanism. The seeds, almost always discarded, are worth reclaiming. Pumpkin seeds, pepitas, are among the highest plant sources of zinc, a mineral involved in immune function, wound healing, and testosterone metabolism in men. Rinse and dry your seeds. Toss with a little olive oil and salt, and roast at 325 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes until golden. For the soup, have your squash and roast cut side down at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes. The caramelization that happens on the cut surface cannot be replicated by boiling. Scoop the flesh into a pot with sautéed onion, 2 cloves of garlic, enough broth to blend smooth, a half teaspoon of cinnamon, a pinch of nutmeg. Blend completely. Then finish with a thread of good olive oil. The fat is not optional. It is the mechanism. Number 1. Nettle and herb green soup, the healing pot that turned weeds into medicine. We have arrived at number 1, and it deserves the full weight of that position. In Ezekiel chapter 47, the prophet receives a vision of a river flowing from the temple, water that heals everything it touches. And along its banks, trees bearing fruit and leaves whose purpose, the text says, is for the healing of the nations. The Hebrew word used is terufa, a word that carries both the meaning of medicine and the meaning of restoration. Along that healing river, in the prophet's vision, grew wild herbs and greens, not cultivated, not purchased, growing from the banks of the water, freely given. That image, the wild green, freely given, growing where no one planted it, bearing healing, has been interpreted for centuries as symbolic. But it also describes something that every ancient herbal tradition recognized as literally true, that the plants growing at the edges, the ones no one cultivated or commercialized, were often the most medicinally potent of all. In traditional Chinese medicine, a soup of mixed greens and medicinal herbs called qing chai tang was the foundational restorative prescription for depleted patients after illness. Childbirth, or long exertion. In Ayurvedic tradition, a preparation called sag leafy greens, cooked with warming spices, was prescribed not only as food, but as rasayana, a class of preparation designed specifically to rejuvenate the tissues. In Native American healing traditions across the eastern woodlands, a spring tonic soup made from whatever first greens emerged, including nettles, lamb's quarters, chickweed, and dandelion, was given specifically to those who had endured a hard winter. 2. As the tradition described it, wake the blood. 3. Independent healing traditions, each arriving at the same prescription, a soup of mixed wild and garden greens, taken in spring or in recovery. As restoration food, modern phytochemical research on mixed green preparations has found something interesting that the individual studies miss. Researchers studying the phenolic compounds in mixtures of leafy greens have found that certain antioxidant reactions are synergistic. The combined effect of quercetin from parsley, camphorol from kale, luteolin from celery leaves, and chlorogenic acid from dandelion greens exceeds what any single compound produces alone, with results that have led researchers to argue for studying whole food combinations rather than isolated compounds. The old cooks, sweeping every available green into the pot, were accidentally practicing what modern nutritional science is only beginning to formalize. Dandelion leaves still pulled, as weeds from most gardens contain more beta-carotene than carrots, more calcium than milk by weight, and a compound called tarixacin that has been studied for its effects on bile production and liver function. Lamb's quarters, another common garden weed, contains significantly more iron and calcium than spinach. Chickweed, the low-growing plant most people fight all spring, has been used in traditional herbal medicine as a cooling, anti-inflammatory food, and is rich in saponins that have been studied in laboratory settings for their effects on cellular membranes. The pot that grandmothers assembled from the odds and ends of the garden, the beet tops, the outer cabbage leaves, the bolted spinach, the herbs that had gone slightly woody, was not a pot of scraps. It was a pot of concentrated, diverse phytochemical medicine, and the fact that it cost nothing and wasted nothing was not incidental. It was the whole lesson. Here is the preparation. Gather whatever tender greens you have access to: kale, chard, spinach, beit dops, dandelion leaves, if they are young, parsley, fresh thyme. Sauté 1 large onion and 2 cloves of garlic in good olive oil over medium heat until completely soft. Add 1 diced potato for body. Pour in enough broth to cover everything generously. Simmer 15 minutes. Add the greens in the final 5 minutes, only no longer. Blend smooth. The color should be a deep, living green. Finish with a generous squeeze of lemon. This is not optional. The acid brightens both the flavor and, research suggests, the bioavailability of the iron in the greens. A drizzle of olive oil at the end. Drink it warm, slowly, the way you would take something seriously. There is one thing that runs through every soup in this countdown that is worth naming plainly before you leave. Every single one of these soups requires something that the modern food industry has spent 60 years engineering us away from: time. Not enormous time, Not inconvenient time, but unhurried time. The onion that needs 45 minutes to caramelize properly. The lentils that need the full simmer to collapse into silt. The barley that needs 90 minutes to release its beta-glucan into the broth. The greens that need to go in at the very last minute, and not a minute before. Processing, heating, refining, extracting. These are the things that strip what the plant spent its entire life accumulating. Every time we shorten the preparation and lengthen the shelf life, something is lost. The grandmother, who stood at that stove, was not inefficient. She was honoring a process that could not be accelerated without losing the point. The ancient physicians, whether they worked with Hebrew scriptures, Chinese pharmacopoeias, Ayurvedic texts, or European herbal manuals, understood something that our era is slowly returning to, that the relationship between the food and the body is not a transaction. It is a conversation, and it requires patience from both sides. The question worth sitting with, the one this list opens rather than closes, is this: what else did our grandparents know that we have not yet thought to ask? If these soups stirred something in you, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to stay with us as we keep following these old trails back to what was always there. And leave a comment, tell us which of these soups your own grandmother made, and what topic you would like us to explore next. We read every one. The pot is still simmering. Come back soon.